Welcome to Just Theory, a series of conversations that champions female-led ideas in legal theory and philosophy. In this episode, we will tell you how the project came about and why you should also be excited about female legal scholarship. So, without further ado, I present you Episode 1, the teaser.
Hello and welcome to this Legal Theory podcast. My name is Dr. Emilia Mickiewicz, and I'm a lecturer in law at Newcastle Law School. I'm absolutely delighted to bring this podcast to you, which spans both legal theory and legal fields, both of which I'm absolutely passionate about. And I'm bringing this project together with Aleksandra. Hello, Aleksandra.
Who will introduce herself.
Yes.
I am Aleksandra Wawrzyszczuk. I'm a research assistant for the project. I am also a graduate student at NYU Law School, where I'm completing my LLM in legal theory. And I must say, I'm very excited to finally be doing this project. It's been years in the making, pretty much since my undergrad. And you may remember our initial conversations about this back in like 2012, maybe, when I remember bringing this up to your attention that for every single citation, one of the papers that we discussed, that was, a citation by the likes of Philippa Foot or Elizabeth Anscombe, you would have like 50, 60, 120 citations by male philosophers. And I think as a kind of budding legal researcher in law and philosophy and legal theory, this absence of female presence, it's an awkward sentence, but this absence of just feminine presence in academia was resounding and so strange.
Yeah, I think you did mention, obviously, Philippa Foot and Elizabeth Anscombe, both of whom were pioneers in female philosophical scholarship. They belong to Oxford, to the school known as the Female Oxford for Philosophers, along Iris Murdoch and Mary Midgley. Mary Midgley said that they only came to prominence because at the time when they've been at Oxford, and that was the Second World War, there were no men at Oxford at the time.
Oh, because they were at war, right? Yeah,
they were. Yes, so it was kind of sad that she believed that the only reason why female philosophers were able to be heard was because there were no men in the room. So yes, I thought this kind of resonates well with historical circumstances or historical path that some women had to forge.
So think about a thought experiment. And I mean, you can tell it's a philosophy podcast because we're already doing a thought experiment. But entertain me. If all men disappeared now, can you imagine just wandering the corridors of, NYU or Newcastle or any other institution with this complete absence of men? Would be so strange. But at the same time, this thought kind of makes me happy. And not happy because I don't want to see any men in academia. That's completely not the case. But because there would be more of us than just the four women like, Anscombe, Foot, Murdoch, and Midgley. Yeah. And I think that so much work has been done in recent years to build that presence.
I love this thought experiment. But this is precisely what I would like this to stay at. I would like this to remain just a thought experiment, because in reality, what we want to foster and create is an environment which is truly inclusive, regardless of your background, of your gender, where we have a genuine dialogue in philosophy where everyone can participate in an equal measure. So I think what we're trying to do with this podcast is to normalize female presence in academia. If you agree with me, obviously.
I think normalizing is a great way to put it. And also just the title of our project, the Just Theory, it's not to do with justice. It's to do with the fact that we're only interested in ideas and promoting this exchange of ideas and a dialogue, regardless of anybody's background, anybody's identity. I think is exactly what we need. And as part of it, normalizing the presence of women in room full of men in that particular field, especially, analytic jurisprudence. It's you might remember this. Remember when I was very junior and I had the privilege, I was invited to respond to a paper by this really established male law professor, and we entered the room full of people, and the first thing he says to me before even saying hello is, "Oh, you're so tall. Are you a basketball player?" And I'm like, "No, I'm a grad student responding to your paper."
It's quite remarkable that this kind of narratives and comments remain present today in the 21st century.
But less so every day. And also, we must be careful. I don't want to give anybody the impression that we're organizing a little pity party. I think that there is so much power in the scholarship, but it's just about normalizing, and it's about promoting ideas and exchanging ideas and doing it in an also entertaining fashion, I think.
Yeah, and we obviously we welcome men to come along to our podcast and respond to some of our speakers. So we are creating that truly inclusive environment. What is also interesting, you did mention that we want to create a more kind of entertaining podcast, or one that is more accessible. That again connects to Mary Midgley, whose legacy was to produce philosophy that is accessible to an everyday person, not some kind of exclusive audience.
Yes, I do agree. We need this kind of inclusive environment. We need to do it in a more accessible fashion. And I always, when I read, do you remember postmodern POMO generator? So there is a kind of algorithmic app that's web-based.
I'm not quite sure if I do remember.
So it generates gibberish, but it makes it sound academic. So it's like essays that make no sense, an article that makes absolutely no sense, but it sounds very clever. And I think there is this tendency, and I think it's also very prevalent, especially among my peers in grad school. We've all been through that phase when we try to sound clever, especially if, maybe the topic is quite complex. And simplifying that and detangling that, I think, is going to be the key to expanding and also to survival of philosophy in academia in a way.
This objective resonates really well with your personal objective, if I may say so, because I believe your mind is much more kind of analytical mind or analytic mind than mine, or you would often associate yourself with this analytic tradition, which is committed to clarity, to pure meaning, and clarifying concepts in a transparent fashion. Am I right there?
Yeah, I agree to an extent. And I think the idea of the podcast also came from all those conversations that we were having, the very heated discussions about various philosophical concepts, and whether they were part of our research projects or just something we read. It would be great to start talking about the super complex themes and present those disagreements in a more accessible fashion. So you obviously come from a different tradition. I'm a robot brain. Computer says no, and you're like, oh, but we should definitely bring more pragmatism to it, and everything needs to be more for the people.
Yeah, as much as I'm absolutely impressed and with your pristine mind and your commitment to clarity, I have to say that sometimes what is sometimes known as continental tradition recognizes that life is more complex than some analytical or analytic philosophers would like it to be. So sometimes we are subject to incommensurable forces that go against one another, and we have to make sense out of them. So I think we're coming from two very different angles, and perhaps if we have this commitment to clarity, maybe this is a good opportunity to explain to our listeners what do those terms analytic and continental actually mean, if you think it makes sense to define since we're so committed to clarity.
Otherwise, we're going to be so it's going to be hypocritical to just talk about clarity and accessibility and then just keep on talking about, talking in mystical terms. But as you know,
how would you define analytic tradition then, Aleksandra?
It's probably better if you define it, because of course, from my perspective, there is philosophy and then continental literature. That's very nice. Oh, sometimes not so nice to read. But completely seriously, I think if we define analytic philosophy more in terms of promoting clarity of thought and promoting an almost mathematical scientific approach to matters such as language, then we are getting onto something. But then one caveat that I would make is that this distinction, as you know, can be quite artificial. And I think in recent years, especially, it's become much more artificial and the lines have become much more blurred.
I would definitely agree with you that the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy is somewhat artificial. And someone who I'm sure is coming to your mind at the moment is an Austrian philosopher who is often associated with analytic tradition, yet his works span a whole spectrum of traditions, is Ludwig Wittgenstein. And in his early works, he is often thought of as someone who was committed to analytic philosophy, to clarity, to purity, to scarcity of language. His leading motto in the Tractatus was not to speak about things that cannot be expressed in a meaningful fashion. So he was very, very, how to put it, restrained in terms of what he wants to put on paper. And that was always read as his commitment to analytic clarity and somewhat reductionist vision of the world, which fails to recognize the importance of ethics and other matters, metaphysical matters that are often associated with continental philosophy. But I think it's unfair. And some philosophers like Ray Monk, for example, would argue that even the early Wittgenstein was committed to a broader contextual analysis of the world, because that motto was essentially his, he wanted to express his respect for those big ideas that cannot be spoken of. So I think this is a good example of how analytic tradition and continental tradition cannot be clearly distinguished.
You can almost see me just being super keen to pounce on that, because for me, we also need to make a distinction between the original works of a philosopher and the entire scholarship that branched out of those original works, and that almost takes a life of its own. And that tying back to the purpose of our project, because you didn't have so many female Kants, as I call them, this super productive, influential philosophers with an even bigger following and a disproportionately bigger body of work of their followers, then I think some of those ideas tend to, from female scholars or female philosophers, can be lost somewhere in the libraries or not get the attention that they really deserve, or not get the following that they really deserve. And I think the aim of our project is to also bring those ideas to light and give them the following and start building the following that they really deserve.
Yeah, this is why some of our podcasts will be devoted to historical figures in legal theory or in philosophy more generally, and the impact they had on legal theory today. So this is reflected, or this commitment to a recovery of some past ideas will be present in what we do with this series of podcasts.
Yeah, and I think the best example of that, it will be of our discussion about the female representatives of the Warsaw School of Logic. And I am also particularly excited for this episode because I look forward to hearing about your project in model logic. and bringing it to legal theory. I think that's super exciting. And I'm also hoping that it will make logic more accessible, because we all need a little bit of algorithmic thinking in our life.
That's something I would like to again slightly depart from, or I hope to domesticate some complex logical ideas and make them more accessible to our audience. So, for example, you mentioned Warsaw School of Logic, and Tarski was one of the leading figures there. He was an incredibly charismatic philosopher, but also an incredibly obscure one. And this is hardly surprising, because mathematics and logic tend to be obscure. However, the idea of modal logic itself, I think it can be expressed in much more simple terms, and its relevance to law can be expressed in much more accessible terms. What is modal logic? Just to again define and explain, not to be hypocritical here. So modal logic is about taking into account changes, contingencies, the dimensions of time and space into otherwise pure calculus of logic. So we can imagine that classical logic or formal logic would occupy itself with claims that are ever valid, always true, regardless of the circumstances, irrespective of the context in which they are being expressed. But modal logic takes into account modalities of life, or those changing variables, such as time and space. How this works out in practice, we can think of Rylance and Fletcher, and the non-natural use of land, for example, the requirement. What is non-natural in times of war could be natural, or other way around. What is natural in times of war could be non-natural in normal times. You can think of a factory of munition, that producing munition will be a natural use in times of war, but in times of peace, it's going to be considered non-natural use of land. So modal logic is about that. It's about taking into account contingencies of everyday life, practical dimension. And I hope to explain this perhaps better with our actual episode. And I don't want to go into this now, but I hope to kind of simplify those ideas in the modal logic podcast.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And I, as I said, I'm really looking forward to it. We also have an amazing lineup of guests that are at the moment quite hush-hush, because we're obviously finalizing still the details. But we're hoping that some of big names in our field will grace us with their presence, and we'll get the privilege of interviewing them and discussing their scholarship with them. Another thing that I think we need to mention before we wrap up is that one of the episodes will be about Mary Midgley and her connection. Because of her connection to Newcastle, we thought that it would be quite a good figure to soft launch our project with. So the soft launch took place at Newcastle University a while ago, but it would be great to discuss some of the connections to legal theory, most of which we completely made up. So do stay tuned.
Again, I disagree that we completely made up the connection between Mary Midgley's philosophy and legal theory, because she was deeply concerned with some very pertinent ideas in law. So, for example, she was concerned about animal rights, and she was also a moral philosopher. And the question remains, how do we distinguish some important question of morality from questions of law? So that's the division between law and morality. Does it even exist? Or perhaps moral questions are being notoriously present and expressed in case law, in legislation. This is something that is up for exploration, I suppose, in our upcoming episodes.
Yeah, it's better not to get into it now, because of course I disagree with most of the things that you just said. But I do value her insight into normativity, that's for sure. But you know my opinion of Midgley. I think she was just a huge contrarian, and a super fierce woman who was trying to change the rules of the game.
Someone who was very attuned to complexity, I would say.
Exactly. Somebody trying to change the rules of a game, and an absolutely fascinating person to discuss as well.
I think we've been speaking for long enough now. So we are absolutely looking forward to seeing you very soon.
And expect more disagreements. It's going to be plenty of disagreements, plenty of obscure ideas coming to life before your very eyes. So do stay tuned. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Aleksandra here. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like our project, have any questions, or would like to recommend a guest or a topic, drop us a line on just.theory.project@gmail.com. This season was made possible with the generous funding of Newcastle University. If you like, you can buy us a coffee. Your support will enable us to continue our work. Just Theory, changing the face of legal theory.